Hello everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is performance testing using JMeter and Warehouse App Task Validation Framework in Dynamics 365 Supply Chain Management. My name is Alejandra and I will be your moderator today. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Ajay, over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Alejandra. Hi, everyone. My name is Ajay Singh, Principal Solution Architect in the FastTrack team. I have been joined by my colleague Hiren Naik, Senior Solution Architect in the FastTrack team. We also have additional Lai, who is Senior Solution Architect in the FastTrack team. Let's get started. So, as we did another Tech Talk on October 5th, so this is a series of Tech Talk where we are doing two Tech Talk. One is to kind of cover what's new in the Warehouse App Task Validation Framework. And the second of that series is that performance testing using App Task Validation Framework and JMeter to simulate the warehouse device. So I will highly recommend everyone, those who have not joined on the fifth one, to go and look at our recordings. Now, the agenda for today is Warehouse App Task Validation Framework. So I'm kind of touching base at high level what we have done in the last Tech Talk. Then the different scenarios for the performance testing, and then how we can use JMeter to do the performance testing using our Warehouse App Task Validation Framework. And then we will have some resources to share, and in the end, we will have a Q&A. So Warehouse App Task Validation Framework. So in 10.0.35, we kind of made a lot of enhancement, which we covered in the last Tech Talk about what are the enhancements that we have made in App Task Validation Framework. We have exposure as a service, which can be consumed by any application or tool that can automate performance testing using the web service calls. So in SCM itself, so if you have to use, which we covered in the last Tech Talk, is that to validating your warehouse devices using Warehouse App Task Validator, you go to FNO, configure your warehouse task, which is like all the steps that you're going to do, and record that steps. Here in this demo or even the last Tech Talk, we covered a scenario of sales picking. Once you record your scenario in App Task Validator, you can use FNO UI for your unit testing. And you can use Express Plus to call the web service that we here. You need just three parameters: the task ID, the user, warehouse device user, and the variables that we need for a sales picking scenario. Now, we also have a kind of a tool or a set of tool that we released is that you can use that to bulk generate the data. You can use any other tool sets to bulk generate the data, but we also delivered a library that you can use to bulk generate the data. What it helps is helps you to create a bulk sales order, release those sales order to warehouse, and generate the target LP so that you can use for your either consuming into a .NET application, which we covered in the last Tech Talk, to call our web service that we have exposed and monitor the performance, or any third-party tool. It's not limited to just JMeter. We are going to cover in detail JMeter today. So you can use the same web service call in JMeter. What we need to do for the JMeter now is again to prepare the data parameters like generating the bulk data that you needed, recording your scenario, right, and the number of users that you need to simulate for your peak transactions. Now configure these three parameters like the user and the task ID that I needed, and the other variables, which is work and license, target license plate ID for sales picking process. And once I have that, I can go configure my test case in JMeter, and then I can execute the test. Once we execute the test using JMeter by simulating the number of users that we wanted to, then the next thing is us to monitor the load of my FNO environment, which can be done using LCS. So run the test from JMeter, go to LCS, monitor CPU, memory utilization, blocking any sort of slow query, because performance testing is not just about the running test and capturing metrics. It's also about finding an opportunity to optimize, right? So any whether optimization in code, query, or any process itself. So it's always better to monitor and not just to capture the numbers or the performance output. Now, the three different testing scenario. One is that using Warehouse App Task Validator within FNO to validate, either calling into the batch or calling into Express API, or using for unit testing, which we covered in the last Tech Talk. And here's the URL for you to be able to go and look at what we discussed in detail. Option 2 is that using .NET application to call the web service that you have, right? So if you are comfortable using .NET application, you can consume those web services, create a data contract, and execute the test that you wanted to. And we covered that with a demo in last Tech Talk. The third option is that performance testing using JMeter and Azure load testing. So you can use the web service, consume into to JMeter, and even you can use Azure load testing to simulate the test. Now, option 3, which we are going to cover in detail, the using JMeter. Now, the question is that why JMeter, right? We do have several other tool sets available, like you have executive automates available, you have a stress test stimulus, a third-party tool sets, and we have JMeter. Then why we choose to go in the detail with the JMeter? One is that JMeter is very easy to configure and use tool set for the performance testing. That's the kind of one driving factor for us to go deeper in JMeter. The other thing is JMeter is a Java-based tool, so it makes it a platform independent. You can write test case either on the Windows OS box or Mac OS or Linux. So it's not, you're not limited to just Windows only. Then JMeter can be integrated with any CI/CD platform. And the last but not the least is the best supported tool that from our experience we have seen in Azure load testing service. If you guys have not heard about it, and I'll touch this in a bit of a detail, what is Azure load testing service? Now, what is JMeter, right? It's an open source, Apache open source software for our load testing. And it's very extensible. So since it's an open source, like if you go to the JMeter plugins, there is a lot of tools and plugins available that makes JMeter much more, I would say, flexible and much more feature rich because of there are so many plugins available, right? And the JMeter community, also to mention here, JMeter community is so vast that at any point, any help that you need, you can just reach out to the community on any channel that you have, and you can get a very easy or very quick answer from the JMeter community. It's a very vast, a very big community that we have for the JMeter user community that I'm talking about. And then, then what JMeter cannot do. So in terms of like, when I'm simulating my mobile devices or user interactive test, right? JMeter cannot run JavaScript or client-side codes like the HTML rendering. So the time response that you see in JMeter might not be exactly same what you see in the device because we are not capturing the rendering time that device is going to have, right? So, however, still it's a tool that you can use to simulate the users, simulate the test, and monitor the performance of the system. And now, how JMeter works? For those folks who have not used JMeter in past, the way the JMeter works is that we configure the test case in JMeter, right? And then you start test case execution. So once we start the test case execution, JMeter sends the request, the number of users that you have defined to servers. And for us, the servers is our FNO AOS, right? It's making a call to my FNO AOS, and then they get a response back. The JMeter receives a response back with the duration and each step. And then JMeter does, the statistical calculation of the response that they're getting from the AOSs and give us a performance results. That's the report that we can use in JMeter to see where the time being spent and how long it's taking each steps. So that's how the JMeter works. Now, just again for the folks who have not seen JMeter in past, giving you a quick detail about the JMeter UI. So this is how the JMeter UI looks like once you install the JMeter, right? On all the tests in JMeter is configured in hierarchical function. So you'll see on the top node is your test plan name, and within that you will add elements. And the elements are your sampler, and I'll touch base of detail a few of the elements that we are going to use in the performance test. Like you can add a config element, you can add a samplers, and you can add a listener. Now you have an option here. It's called start test. So again, normal start test. Then we have a start test with ignore sleep time. And the question is, what's the difference? The difference is that if you have multiple test cases, and within that test case you have added a sleep time, right? For your debugging purpose, your validation purpose, you don't want to go to that sleep time. So you don't need to modify your test case. You can just use the next start button, which kind of ignores the sleep time, right? Then we have stop test, stop my test or terminator. We also call it shut down my test. And then we have a stop test and wait for sampler to in. So what is the difference between a stop test and a stop test with the sampler to in? So basically, if you are simulating 10 users, right, and the 8th user is running the test right now, if you click stop test, which means that you are terminating. So it will not wait for finishing the 8th user simulation. It will just stop the where it was. However, stop test with wait for the sampler to end is that it will wait for the 8th user to finish their task and then stop. So 9th and 10th won't execute. So that's the difference between the stop test and a stop test with sampler to end. On top, you will see execution time. It also gives you the number of errors if there's any test cases that is failing or erroring out. And then you'll see the number of threads, which is a user that you are running with the out of the total thread that you have defined. And then again, it's a help and function help. It's more about general help and any component of function that you're writing. If you want to help, since it's an extendable framework, open source, you can write your own plugins. And then you have a search about, once you do the help search and function help search, if you want to reset it and start from scratch, you have a reset search. Then search and replace is the normal search and replace. If you want to replace a variable name across all your test cases, you can do a search and replace. Then we have clean up all listeners. So as part of our test plan, which I'm going to touch base in the demo, is that when you create a test plan, you add a listener. Listener is to capture your results. So you run a test and you want to rerun again. You have an option to clean up all the listener that you have added so that you get a fresh data captured, or you can clean up one selected listener, right? And then this main area is the area where you configure and write your scripts that you have to. Again, it's not a read, it's more of a configuration of the scripts, and that's what it makes JMeter is rich and powerful for us to use it. Now, the steps for testing. First is prepare the environment, prepare your FNA environment and the data configuration that we need, right? All that we talked about, recording scenarios and having to create my sales order and release to warehouse and capture the data. Then identify API. The reason we mentioned identify API here is that JMeter is not just limited to our app task validation API that we have exposed as a service. You can use any API in JMeter for the testing, right? And then create a test case in JMeter, which we will cover in demo in detail, and then monitor the execution. Monitor execution of the testing in your JMeter, and then also looking at LCS to monitor CPU memory utilization on any slow query that you wanted to kind of capture and later optimize it. One thing to note here is that since the JMeter API call that we're going to use for app task validator is going to make a normal API call that we have, and it's subject to the throttling pattern that we have for the API calls. Now, the test lifecycle in JMeter. So the test lifecycle for the JMeter is that you script tests in JMeter and debug it using JMeter UI. So you write the test cases, configure out the data elements that you need in JMeter, validate it using JMeter UI, and then run test. You can run test using JMeter UI. You can run test using CLI, which is a command prompt to execute the test of the JMeter. And then you can use Azure load testing, which I'm going to cover in a bit of a detail about what is the Azure load testing and how we can use that. And then analyze the data, the test output, the result that you get out of the JMeter. You can analyze the data using either GUI if you are running from the GUI, or you can, if you are running in Azure load testing, you can analyze the data in Azure load testing tool itself, and then Excel. So if you run the JMeter in a command line format, right, that exports your sample, your listener or your test results into an Excel that you can use to analyze the results and do all sampling that you wanted to do. Now the question comes out here is that why CLI mode? Why can't I use JMeter UI itself? You can use JMeter UI, but what's the limitation and what's the scenario where I should be using CLI or Azure load testing? CLI command line that I should be used, like if you use JMeter UI itself, say for example, I wanted to simulate 200 users, right? And if I use JMeter UI from one of my dev box or my client box, right, from where I'm scripting all the scenario, the client box sometimes becomes a bottleneck because it has to spin up 200 connections with our FNO instance, right, to run the 200 load simulation, right? However, if you run from the CLI, we somehow up to a point, we are minimizing that extra workload created on the client machine or the dev box where we have JMeter test cases running. So you can run JMeter test case using the command prompt, and then you can bring the same test case to Azure load testing services to run it from there. So, and we'll be talking about that in the detail in the further. Now, the main components in JMeter is how you organize your test, right? So, example, your test is organized in a hierarchical function, which I kind of touched based on. So, on the top level container is your test plan name. Within that, you define the thread groups, and again, we will be touching best about all these components in what we're going to use. Like you define your thread groups and different elements within the test, right? And all the tests that gets generated, right? The test plan that you have is an XML file. So once you create a test plan in JMeter and you save it out, the extension is called JMX, but actually the file is an XML. So you can edit that XML in any XML editing tool like Notepad or anywhere. However, from our experience, we are not encouraging or we don't want that to be done, because I have seen that my test breaks if I edit that XML outside JMeter. So at any point of time, if you have created a test plan and you wanted to edit it, we will recommend use JMeter itself to edit the test plan. Now, the main elements in your JMeter test plan, the very first one is the thread group. That represents the set of users that we are going to simulate. So how many users that you are going to simulate. And the thread group itself has several other properties we will be seeing in the demo. And then we have a config element. So within that test plan, you have the number of users that you're going to simulate. Then you have the config element, which is like your data input files, your key management, your cache manager, and so many other things that you can use. Not everything is applicable to our test that we are going to do, but there are so many other features of functionality that we have in the config element. Then we have logical controllers. This is about determining the order of execution. So example, if you have a test plan which has 5 test cases, one is to create sales order, second is to pick the sales order. Then you have to use logical controllers to control the order of execution. Within JMeter test plan, one component is called transaction controller. That's the one which allows us to measure the response. In our test, we will have a two test controller, transaction controller, which I'm going to use. One is to monitor the login time, which is like when I make a call from JMeter to FNO, how long it takes for my mobile device user to log into the warehouse device itself. And then I'll be having another transaction controller is to monitor the response time of the sales picking process that I'm going to do. And then in the end, we have a listener. They are the main components. Again, it's not just limited to that many components. There are so many components we have, but these are the components that we are going to use in our scenario today. Listener that again helps you to collect the data output results from JMeter and analyze it. Now, a quick demo of JMeter test case configuration and execution. So as you can see here, I'm going to just touch base on what we need to do in FNO. So I'll go to warehousing management module here and open warehousing. Within that, I'll be opening warehouse app task validation form, which we have covered in the last tech talk. And within that, right, in this form, we define or record the scenario that I'm going to simulate. So here I'm taking one scenario, which is sales pick. And within that, I have recorded all the steps. Again, we have given a detailed demo about recording scenario in last tech talk. So I will recommend you to go back and look at our last tech talk. And you record the scenario here that you need, and I would need the rec ID of this recording in my test plan. Now I'll go back and open my JMeter. In this box, I'm not going to cover installation of JMeter. We have posted 2 blogs which has covered the details of how to install and configure JMeter. This box I have JMeter installed. I'll go to the Apache JMeter folder that normally gets in C folder. Go to bin. And once you go to bin, within that, you'll see a JMeter batch file. And that's the file which is going to, it's kind of a runnable or executable that is going to open my JMeter UI. So double click and open this one. And it opens up my JMeter. Here I can see here that I have my JMeter UI. And now the very first node is my test plan. I'm not going to create a test plan from scratch. I have a test plan that is already created for the demo purpose. I'm going to kind of explain that. So I open a test plan. Again, the name of the test plan itself, I gave a test plan, but you can give any name. So you can give sales, warehouse device testing, or your FNO, whatever the testing that you wanted to do. And within that, I have added a component, like I mentioned, right? That it's an hierarchical. So I added a component called user defined variable, where I'm defining FNO URL of my environment that I wanted to connect, and the scheme, whether it's an HTTP or HTTPS protocol that I'm going to use, right? Then I define another user-defined variable, which is the recording rec ID. So my task recording is in FNO. So I have two rec ID. One is for the sales, one is for um, sales pick, and one is for the purchase receipt. In this demo, we are going to cover the sales pick only, but I have also recorded a scenario for sales pick. And then I added two more details. One is called HTTP request detail. And again, you can add this, just right click, add nodes, and go to the config element. You can add, all that user defined variables and your HTTP request defaults. So the HTTP request default, what I'm doing here is that I'm defining the scheme that I have variable that defined by like HTTPS, and then I'm defining the server IP, which is the URL that I defined in the very first variable, which is the host name. So I have my FNO environment defined. Cookie manager, I'm not doing a much here. I'm just clearing up the cookie against each iteration. So each iteration, I will just clear the cookie. You can do much more than using the cookie, but I'm not doing much here. Now the next is my actual test case, which is the thread group that we call it out. So that's where I think we will have all my the test cases that I need to use. And the thread group has several other properties that you can see here, which we need to define when we run a test case, like which includes like users, ramp up time, how many times I wanted to run it. And this is the thread groups. And you can add thread groups by just right clicking and add-ins and add thread groups. So once the thread group is added, right, you can see these are the parameters that I have. So I have number of threads, which is the number of users that I'm going to simulate. So I'm going to simulate 10 users. So I have number of threads defined as a 10. Then I can define the number of threads and then the ramp up time. Ramp up time is that how I want to spin up my user. So if you kind of have worked on Visual Studio Testing Agent, then we had an option called step up load, right? So the ramp up time is kind of a step up load. So all 10 users, I'm not going to spin up at one time. All this 10 user is spread over 1 second. So like 0.1 second, then next user, then next user, because that's how in the day in life that happens, right? Not all 100 users and 10 users are going to bombard the system at once. So that's where we define the ramp up time. Then we have a loop count, which is like how many times I wanted to run this test. I can run it infinite. I can define how many times I wanted to run this test. So that's where the loop count comes into the play, that I want to run 10 users 10 times, right? And the last one, the other important component here is that the thread lifetime. You can define that. So example, you wanted to run 10 users 10 times, but that should not exceed 10 minutes. So you want to run simulate users as many as you can within 10 minutes, right? So for that, you define your thread lifetime, which is you can define here in the seconds, that how long you want to run the test, right? And then we have a startup delay, right? So you define your duration, then define your startup delay. Startup delay is nothing but I would say it's warm up time. If you are again familiar with Visual Studio Test Agent, the warm up time, it's a time that gives your Apache JMeter to make a call to FNO so that we are establishing connection. We have the system warm up, and that's the time that it's at that we are defining here in the startup delay, so that we are not hitting a very cold system, and which will add another performance bottleneck effort. The other thing to note is the action here on the top, that what if I had an error while running? Do you want to continue it? Do I want to stop the thread? Do I want to go to the next thread? So you can define those. Here I'm going to use continue in our test. Now within that thread group, I have a recording controller added. Recording controller, again, you can add from add-ins, and you can have a config controller. You can add the recording controller. Now within recording controller, I added a couple of elements. Very first one is CSV data files, right? Again, you can right click, add, and go to config element, and on the very top one is the CSV data files. CSV data file is the input file that I have for list of work ID, and then the target license plate that I'm going to use in my simulation. So I define the file name here, and then I define, again, this is an absolute file name that I'm giving here. Sorry, I'm giving a file name without providing the actual path, and I'll touch base on that one. Within that, I have sales pick user ID. So basically, user ID that is going to be simulate my test. I can define user in my CSV, and then I have the work ID that I need from the CSV, and then I'm going to read the target license plate ID. So there are three different parameters that I need. And then again, these are all default that, how your delimiters are, how your end of file that you have simulated. One thing to kind of note is that why I'm not giving an absolute path, I'm just giving the file name. So if I give the file name itself here, just a CSV sample, a sales pick underscore input data.csv, it's going to look for the root directory where my test case is being saved, which is CWML device testing samples. And that's my test case. So it's going to look for that file in that directory. Why we are doing so? Not by just giving an absolute path. One reason is that, actually two reasons. One reason that if you want to bring the same test case to other box and you want to run it from there, that absolute path might not exist on the other machine, the other box. And then your test, you have to modify to make sure that you are pointing to the right config file. Second is that if you bring the same test case to Azure JMeter, Azure load testing agent, then you need to have a file defined, right? You can't use. Now I added two more transaction controller. Again, that's the thing that I mentioned, right? It captures your performance. So I'm using very well like server or login URL that we have for our FNO login.microsoftonline.com. That's what the default that we have. And then I'm using in HTTP post is that AAD tenant ID. So it's a kind of a default for any API test that you have been doing it so far. Like a tenant ID is /OAuth2/token. So that's the URL that we use, whether we are using .NET API, using any JMeter or any other. So, and along with that, we also defined that the client ID and secret. So the client ID and the secret is the WMA device registration in your AAD, right? So that's the client ID and secret, and it's the same client ID and secret that we used in the last TechTalk. Now I have another transaction controller, which is again the, so I wanted to monitor login, I wanted to monitor my sales picking process, right? So in that sales picking process, I'm adding one more user parameters, right? You can just do by right clicking and add user parameters. What I'm doing here is that I can get the user ID from my file, which I already have in CSV, or I can generate user by writing some function. So what I'm generating here is that HN dash thread name. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until 10, because that's the 10 user that I'm going to simulate. And then I have my another HTTP request, which I can again do by right clicking and go to config elements, and I can add HTTP manager. Now what I'm HTTP manager I can add here. So I'll go back to my sales picking here, which is kind of more important piece, is that I'm defining here. I can give any name that I need to give. So it's not like in that. So I'm defining here is the HTTP request is the post type, and then the API URL, which is again is the same pattern that you guys have been using for any other API test. So I'm giving /API services /warehouse app warehouse validator run instance service, and then I'm using is for the run instance execute service with parameter. So that's the API name, right? There's no lot of logic that we have. It's kind of similar way that we have been using for any other testing that you are doing for the website. The main important part is here is along with that API name, we need the data contract, the input data, the three input data that I need to provide, right? So that the data contract that I defined here in the bottom section at the body, as you can see here, that the three data input is that I have is the sales pick task rec ID is the recording, of the rec ID, which I defined in the variable number 2 on the top. And then, and that's the rec ID, right? It be generated in FNO, and now I have the rec ID defined. And then I have the user ID, which I'm again generating from the user parameters, right? Just in a step above that I have that I'm generating the user ID. Now I have two more parameters that I needed was again like target license plate and all. Now here in the HTTP header manager, I'm not doing much. I'm just trying to find the bearer tokens and other protocols that I needed to. I also define here, so all this like all these components. Now your test is configured. You have variables defined. You have your transaction controller defined. Now I go at summary report. So basically, the listeners, right, where you capture the test data out from the results. So you can have a summary report. You can just right click and add listeners. You can have a tree, a view trees, view results in tree format. So basically, that gives you each and individual run with the tree format. And then you can have a view results in the tabular format. It's like each the detail of the summary that you are seeing, right? So that's how you can capture the JMeter test runs results in FNO. Now I'll just switch back to show you the how my data input file looks like. So that's the folder that I was talking about. So I'll open my CSV file that I have here, and I have defined 10 work IDs and then the 10 license plate ID. I'm not giving user ID here because I'm generating from a formula that I mentioned earlier and the user parameter. So that's the file that I have as an input. So I'll go switch back to JMeter. Here I have everything defined. Now the time for me to run my test. I'll go ahead and start executing the test. So once you click execute run test, now you can go to your listeners and view the data. Just give a couple of seconds, few seconds for test. Now you can see here that the logins is all happening because I had two transaction controller. One is for the login, one is for my actual operation. So now you can see that within the login is happening. Now my tests are running here and all tests completed already. So I can go select one, just one, and you can see the detail here in terms of, and you can also see the what kind of parameter that we use. So we use the rec ID, user HN7, and you use the license plate and the work ID that you use in the test. Now you can go and look at the same data in the summary. So you have 10, and overall 10 is taking around 10,000 millisecond on average. Now if you go to the detail where you can see that each run and the time that is being taken for each run. So you can see all the data. You can export the data into CSV from here, and you can use it it anywhere like for your analysis. So now that's the kind of using and configuring a test case in JMeter to run a warehouse app task validation. Now I can go back to FNO and look at how this test case has been executed. So I'll select the recording that I had, and I'll go to view transistory, and now you can see here all the 10 users that I simulated HN1 until HN10. So all these 10 user that I simulated, I can see each individual run, the total time that it's taking, and then each individual task within that recording, how long it's taking, like going to the main menu, going to the sales picking process, scanning work, how long it's taking, and how long it's taking for me to scan the LP. Now we will just touch this is about what is Azure load testing that we have been mentioning a couple of times in our slide. So the Azure load testing is a fully managed Azure load testing service that we, I think, recently released early this year. Not recently, I would say it's early this year that we released. So it's allow us to run your load test on high scale. What it means by high scale is that if you run test from a dev box, right, and simulate thousands users or 500 users, your dev box sometimes become the bottleneck for your performance, right? And for you to avoid, you can use Azure load testing service where you can spin off as many test services that you want, so that the source machine itself, which you're going to run test, is not becoming the bottleneck, right? Azure load testing has also provides for us to, without any modification, bringing the same test case that we had that we executed in JMeter to Azure load testing. We can easily bring the same test case without any modifications, right? Also, it eliminates the need of infrastructure. What it means is that you don't need a dev box. Once you create the test cases, have your data config element defined, your test case defined, bring the JMeter to Azure load testing. You don't need to worry about to maintaining your dev box. Earlier, we have been doing it for our Perf SDK or any other tool set that we use. Other advancement or the feature that we have in that you can compare the results of your load test. So example, you had a last month's code deployment and you have a code deployment this month. The users are complaining about the performance regression or whatever the thing, and you want to compare like what's the difference, where the difference that we are seeing. So you have capability that you can compare the two output results in Azure load testing service. Now, at high level, what's the architecture of Azure load testing service? So, again, it's a managed service by Microsoft. And when you create a test case on Azure load testing, you define the test engine, how many test engine that you want to do based on the number of users that you are simulating. Our recommendation is that if you have 45 users, you are good with one test engine. But if you are going to have more users added, you can increase the number of test engine, and it's configurable. And I'll show a quick demo on that one. And you can bring in your JavaScript, like JMeter script. So basically, the JMeter you can bring in here and upload in Azure load testing service to be executed. When the load testing service runs your test case, it gives you a dashboard which gives you an output of the test run, like the user that you simulated, and what are the response time for average, and you can download that into to Excel. It also gives you a metrics of the resource, metrics of your test engine itself. So example, you simulated 100 users with one test agent, and now if you see that the very high utilization of the CPU in the test agent itself, which means that sometimes the delay is not because of your test running FNO slow, maybe the test agent itself is running, it's kind of an overwhelm with the number of requests. The other thing to note here is that Azure load testing service provides you an Azure monitor integration. Now, how it's going to help? In our case, it's not a lot of help that we have, but in normal scenario in Azure load testing, so what you can do is that you can monitor your CPU utilization on your web service that you are running, your SQL utilization using Azure Monitor. So one tool to not just monitor your test case execution, but also monitor the underlying infrastructure. Now, when we run an FNO test on tier 2 and onwards, we don't have access to the underlying components in Azure, and we are limited to go and look at utilization using LCS. However, that provides an for way for you to able kind of monitor the underlying components as well. How in future, once we expose the data in App Insight, we might have that integration. I don't want to commit anything on that one, but we do have an integration with App Insight to kind of display along with one dashboard which shows my test case execution, which shows my metrics, and then it also shows my resource utilization. Now a quick demo of bringing the same test case that we had created in the very first demo to the Azure load testing, and it's very easy, and that's what I wanted to show, that how easy it is to bring the same test case and execute without anything that you need to modify. So I'll go to my dev box, and clearly I have created a folder on my dev box, and I named it like Azure load testing. So and what I've done here is nothing, just I copied my test case that I had, test plan, and the input data file. And I modified the input data file with the new data input that I needed, because the work that I had here last time is already closed. Now I'll go to Azure portal. So it's on your Azure portal, and go to Azure load testing. Within that, you'll create Azure load testing services. I'm going to use one existing that I have created called WMS device API test. And when you create, you just define the resource group, right? And then you define other information, like the key thing here is to note is the location, right? We want to make sure that when you create an Azure load testing service, choose the right location. So if your FNO is hosted in US East, choose US East, because you don't want to add a latency between the cross data center calls. So example, your FNO is deployed in West Europe and your your test service is deployed in East US. So you are adding another latency into that one because you will have to make. Now I'll go to my test and I can just, I have a couple of tests created, right? Just click here and upload a test script. So you can see how easy it is to bring my existing test script using Azure load testing. So I can just give a name, WMA perf test, right? And I just give a kind of description. I'm not, and then I have marked here run test application. So once I create the test, I want to execute then and there, right? So just once creation is finished, execute it. So just I have checked it. You can uncheck it to plug in with any CI/CD. The next is to bring my files. So upload my JMX file or my JMeter test case that I had created along with the input files. So I'll go ahead and upload. It's in the same folder, Azure load test, and I select both the files that I have, input file and my test plan. Upload it here, and then I'll hit upload. So once you that, it just validates that your file is correct, your JMeter product. Then I'll go to the next. This is another important part of the Azure load testing services, but it's not relevant to us because to defining the environment that you are gonna connect, defining the kind of secret that you're gonna use, like your client secret, a client ID and the secret. And if you are going to use a certificate for authentication, you can define this one. This is already defined. Now the next is to spin up the number of test agents. I'm going to use one, but spin up as many as you want. There's a limit by each region. For each you have 100 test agent limit. Now you can configure your network traffic. Are you going to use public internet traffic or you have your own? Right? Then this is a parameter for my test criteria. How do I consider test as a success, failure? Do I want to look at the response time? Do I want to look at the errors? You can define that. And then you can define like in the percentage and the time window for your test run, right? So I can define that, error percentage, if the less than 90% in 60 minutes, I want to consider that as a test fail. So you can define that. Now here the piece that I was talking about, that Azure Monitor integration. So you can add your resources to monitor their performance as well here. However, for FNO scenario, like I mentioned, it's not something that we can do it. Again, you can do it if you are going to run test against your dev box. You can add your resource group here. You can add your VM to monitor the performance of that underlying VM. For FNO, we cannot do that. Now, my test case creation completed, validation succeeded, then I'll create a test. Now you can see on the top that it created the test case, started to create a test case, and started to validate. So once that validation finishes up, I can see here that my validation finished. I'll just do a refresh. Once I refresh it here, I can see my test here. I'll go to my test. Now you can see here that test has not started now. I'll just keep refreshing it until, so now you see it's provisioning. What it means for provisioning is that it's provisioning the test agent. So it's not provisioning my test case. So I defined one test agent. So right now it's provisioning the test agent for me. Once you have the test agent provisioned, then the next step is to start running the test case, right? And you have two tabs here to look at. Load test results and the engine health itself, right? Give us few seconds while it's provisioning the test, and then we can see that it will start running the test here, right? And the two tabs is kind of more important. One is to look at the engine health, and the other one is to look at, now you can see here that my test completed. It's still executing, however, but you can see here that this is my engine health. Now just keep refreshing. It's still executing my test engine health, my CPU utilization, memory utilization that I have. My test is done. I'll move to the results, and you can see that I simulated 5 users, right? And here is the time, the average time being taken, the time taken for executing my test, and you can see a request per second that you have made to FNO. So these kind of details that you can see. You can rerun the same test. You can compare against the other, or you can download that as an XML CSV for you to be analyzing the data outside Azure load testing. So we are kind of an end to our demos where we kind of give a kind of brief overview of JMeter and Azure load testing. Now, some additional resources. So we have one tech talk done, which you can go and look at here. Then we have a docs article regarding using RSET and what is the detail of warehouse app task validation for you to go and learn more about this tool itself. One thing to mention, and I have mentioned a couple of times in the past, is that part one, part two of our blog, where we kind of explain about why use JMeter in more detail with comparison against our Powerface DK and what's the difference. Then we also have a part two of that one, which explains you regarding installing configuration of JMeter, which I did not cover in this tech talk in the interest of time. So you can, I will highly encourage you to look at our two blogs, part one, part two, and then go and use the what we learned here today. And we're also planning to post two more blog articles, which is about analyzing the result in JMeter and some of the tips. Um, and and we'll plan like in H1 more tech talks around using JMeter for UI-driven performance testing. Here, this session was more focused around using the API calls. All the test plan that I was sharing here will be posted on our FastTech GitHub repository, where you can just simply download the JMX file, provide the data input file, data into the input file that we have, and you can simply use it for your execution, or you can edit in your JMeter. We do have two Yammer groups to kind of look for more questions if you have further. And that brings to the end of our presentation. And now we are open for questions.
Thanks, Ajay. I think we have answered most of the questions, but I think we can touch base again on a couple of. So just one comment I want to make before I go into the question is that today what you saw in the demo, what Ajay was showing is from JMeter, you can call the warehouse app task validation web service. The blogs which we have published so far, that talks about the UI testing, user interface, how you can go into the like sales order form, create a sales order line, post sales order. So those kind of tests, if you want to test using JMeter, that the blogs which we have published talks about that part of a testing. And we are also planning to publish TechTalk around that. How you can use JMeter to do the UI testing and UI performance testing. So you can just stay tuned for that, and as we publish more details. In terms of questions, we saw that one of the question was asked, is it possible to export the test results directly to a database? And I think Edison already responded that. Yes, you can definitely do that from JMeter. There are different samplers available in JMeter. As Ajay was mentioning, there are different add-ins, so it makes it flexible and more user-friendly. So you can use like JDBC sampler to basically execute the SQL statement to insert the results into the database. You just need to configure the JDBC connection in your JMeter. Or the simplest way is to basically export that data into CSV file and then import it into any SQL databases, and then from that database you can use it for either Power BI or any other purposes, right? So you have a lot of ways to analyze that result once the result is captured in JMeter. Another question is around authentication from JMeter. So again, from JMeter, what we are doing is we are calling a web service to Dynamics 365 SCM, and we are calling a web service. So we are authenticating first against D365, and this authentication mechanism is no different than any other authentication mechanism, whether you use it in integration. When you integrate D365 SCM with D365, you basically use the application ID and secret key to generate the authentication token, and then use that token to basically call the web service and pass your parameters, right? So there shouldn't be any issue in terms of MFA or anything like that.
There's one question here, and is that how friendly is the JMeter? As you can see in the demo, it's easy to configure and bring your test cases anywhere that you wanted to. However, it's not going to replace RSET. RSET is more designed for regression, and this is more for simulating more users and doing a load testing.
Okay, I think we have received couple of more questions. Is JMeter will substitute RSAT? Both are designed for different purpose, I would say. RSAT is more for automating your automation testing. It is not meant for like performance testing or load or volume testing. So for your load and volume testing needs, still you can use JMeter. RSAT is more for a single unit automation testing.
And I think we need to have the further follow up about the MFA question for the UI testing. So I can take it. Actually, from our recommendation, we always recommend the customer to disable the MFA for the performance testing, because MFA, you can think about that MFA, we are not doing the testing for the MFA. So that's why we always suggest to disable it. And also we are generator testing user in the performance testing. So we are not assume the testing user should be enabled the MFA for the performance testing. But definitely we will cover the UI testing in the TechTalk later soon.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Edison.
There's one more question is about, is MSFT customers are using JMeter? And yes, they are using JMeter for both kind of scenarios, FNO, UI driven testing, and the service call. So we do have customers using it. How many? I don't have that number. And the overall feedback that we see is very positive. It's easy to configure and use. Yeah, it's little bit different than API test what we discuss here. If you read out two blocks, for you to record the UI driven scenarios, right? You need to have a different add-ins to be installed and record the scenario in FNO and then execute it. Yes, it's different, but it's not that difficult to use, and we have customers using it. There is one more question, is that what is the platform of the JMeter, which I think we already touched based in the previous slide. The platform is the JMeter is Java platform. So use JDK 8.0 onwards that JMeter uses, and that's the reason that it makes a platform independent testing tool that you can run on any platform. So there is one question is around some user services implement concurrency. Yes. So in concurrency to prevent the overload, if the load testing exceeds that limit, the Azure may start blocking the throttling incoming request and affecting the concurrency validity for load test result. How to overcome that challenges? I think that's a good question, and which I kind of mentioned in one of the slide, is that when you simulate the loads, right, using Azure load testing, it's an API calls that you are making to FNO, right? And API calls are subject to throttling, that we have the throttling limit and the resource-based throttling, and the duration throttling is subject to that throttling. Can we adjust? Maybe not. We cannot adjust this throttling, but you can set it up the priority for your throttling. But yes, there is a way to handle it. But there's a chances of resource getting throttled in FNO. So API calls are being throttled. UI driven test, if you do using JMeter, we don't throttle unless the resource utilization on your server. Like, so when I say server, is your AOS user interactive AOS is reaching to the limit. You might see some test cases started to fail or timeout. Other than that, there is no throttling for the UI driven test. However, there is a throttling for the API call.